Hey guys, this is Geoff Ulrich for linemovement.com, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about strokes gained stats in golf. And specifically, we're going to be talking about what is strokes gained, how does it work, what type of strokes gained stats are there, and how can we apply these stats for betting purposes. So what is strokes gained? Strokes gained is a stat created in 2011 by Professor Mark Broadie. And back then it was created as just a putting stat. But today there's strokes gained stats for pretty much every facet of a player's game. What does it do? Well, essentially what strokes gained is doing is giving us a number that allows us to measure a player against the field. There's a lot more that goes into it, but at the end of the day, that is essentially what it's doing. It's measuring players against each other. And at the end of the day, at the end of each round, players are awarded a positive or a negative number in strokes gained categories based on their performance of the day. Strokes gained stats is building on older stats like greens in regulation, driving accuracy. It's trying to give us more color than those stats, so it's trying to give us more specific data and information. So greens in regulation, you might have two players who both hit 80% of the greens in a round, but those two players aren't necessarily that equal. One player could be hitting all his approaches to 40 feet. The other player could be hitting all his approaches to 7 feet. And in a strokes gained approach stat, the player that hits it closer, that's hitting it to 7 feet on all his approaches, is going to have a far more positive number at the end of the day than the player who is hitting it to 40 feet on every green. So realistically, strokes gained stats are trying to build on some of those older stats like driving accuracy and greens in regulation and give us more color to what the players are doing every round. And they do that by awarding players numbers at the end of each round. Again, either positive or negative, weighted against the rest of the field to give us a view into their round. So what type of strokes gained stats are there? We have strokes gained off the tee, strokes gained approach, strokes gained around the green, strokes gained putting, and then one at the end too, strokes gained tee to green. Those are the 5 main ones we're going to want to focus on. Now, strokes gained off the tee is exactly what it sounds like. It's measuring players' performance with the driver and off the tee. It doesn't apply to par 3s, so you could have a player who's really good off the tee and with his driver doesn't necessarily play the par 3s well, something to keep in mind. For the most part, players who do well in strokes gained off the tee, they're going to be good drivers of the ball, hit it long, but also hit a lot of fairways. Guys who are short hitters and hit a lot of fairways can also have good metrics and strokes gained off the tee stats. Players with good strokes gained off the tee stats often pop up at places like the US Open, players like Dustin Johnson, Brooks Koepka, long drivers, consistent drivers of the ball. These guys tend to flourish at a little bit longer, tougher golf courses. Strokes gained approach stats, exactly what it sounds like. Any shot outside of 30 yards away from the green is going to be considered strokes gained approach. Iron play, fairway woods do fall into that, and short pitch shots though as well. Strokes gained approach stats is essentially measuring iron play though, and often when you hear about a player who does well in this category, you're thinking of someone who's a good iron player. Strokes gained around the green, any shot within 30 yards of the hole is considered there. So bunker play, greenside rough, players who are good scramblers tend to do really well in this category. And then strokes gained putting, exactly what it sounds like. Any shot taken on the green is going to fall in the strokes gained putting category. One thing to note about putting, it does tend to be very, very high variance in terms of how players are doing it week in, week out. Even the strong putters tend to have really big dips in this stat. And you'll also see a lot of the top players aren't necessarily that highly ranked in strokes gained putting. They'll be highly ranked in other categories like ball striking, approach, and off the tee play, but their strokes gained putting stats may not be as consistent. Strokes gained tee to green is one we should definitely hit on. It's basically a conglomeration of the player's performance in all categories up to them hitting the green. So off the tee, approach, and around the green. This is a really important stat for betting as well because the top players tend to be really consistent in this category. Players like Dustin Johnson, Justin Thomas, these guys are almost always ranked inside the top 10 or 20 in strokes gained tee to green at the end of the season. So it's an important metric to look at. Again, not as much variance there as putting. So how can we apply strokes gained stats to betting purposes every week? Well, strokes gained is giving us a view into how a player is performing on a week in, week out basis. We can check their positive or negative performances at the end of each round and see where a player has done well. This helps us with course fit, going to places like the US Open. If a player is doing really well off the tee or in their ball striking, that might give us a little bit more of a reason to back a said player. And again, we want to look for consistency in stats like strokes gained tee to green. A player might be coming off a couple bad putting performances, but if they're doing well in the strokes gained tee to green category or the strokes gained approach category, we might feel like there's a big week coming for this player because, again, putting tends to be high variance. And again, I go back to Dustin Johnson. Dustin Johnson from 2016 to 2019, he was ranked inside the top 10 in strokes gained tee to green category every year. He also won multiple times on tour in that stretch. But for strokes gained putting, he was never ranked inside the top 10. In fact, he had multiple years where he was ranked outside the top 50 in strokes gained putting. So that just gives you an idea how the top players, oftentimes their ball striking, their strokes gained tee to green stats, we can see if they're playing well and being consistent there. We don't necessarily have to worry as much about their putting stats. And that might be a good way to really look for good value plays in betting. Players who are trending well in the ball striking categories, tee to green, approach, and off the tee, but maybe necessarily haven't popped in the putting category yet. That can lead us to some really good value plays for golf betting. That's pretty much it for this video, guys. Really appreciate you guys checking it out. Make sure you do check out linemovement.com after you're done watching here. There's weekly golf betting previews for the PGA up there every week. Give this video a like if you could, and make sure you check out the site after. Really appreciate it. Talk to you again soon.